Welcome. I'm Cassidy Cash. This is That Shakespeare Life, the show where we go behind the curtain and into the real life and history of William Shakespeare. Follow us on YouTube for every Saturday. We are here with a great history episode. We tend to think of roses as the ultimate romantic gift, wrapped, arranged, or handed over to your love on Valentine's Day to say that you love them. But in Shakespeare's England, roses really didn't work like that, not at all. People did give flowers as gifts and even roses as gifts, but they weren't this grand romantic gesture that we think about them today. And they didn't actually have the same meanings that we associate with roses today either. Understanding the difference between 16th century roses and modern day roses really changes how you view Juliet's famous line about roses of another name. Let's dive in and take a look at exactly what she meant when she said this line. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, flowers were part of everyday life. They grew in household gardens, they were gathered in fields, they were sold at markets and people would buy them. But because they were so common, flowers were rarely considered a luxury gift. When someone gave a flower, it was usually this small, informal token of a single bloom or a sprig or even a modest bunch of flowers that would have been offered from person to person when you're standing there looking at them. Flowers were meaningful not because they were expensive, but because flowers themselves carried symbols. You may have heard about rosemary being used for remembrance, for example. A lot of plants, and particularly flowers, had these kind of connected meanings that were much more, I'm going to say, readily known than they are today. I mean, flowers, when you go and look them up, can still have meanings. But for most of us, we would have to go to an encyclopedia and research that. We don't have it close to hand. For Shakespeare, these would have been things that people knew about flowers. They believed that flowers carried these layered meanings, and roses in particular were powerful symbols. A rose could represent a variety of things. First of all, roses represented beauty, but it was beauty understood as both fragile and temporary. Roses bloom very briefly and then they fade away very quickly. To Shakespeare's audience, that made roses this ideal symbol for youth and physical attractiveness. They were things to be admired, but you also distrusted them a little bit because they weren't going to last. Roses also carried the idea of pleasure mixed with danger. The thorn on the rose mattered a whole lot more than it does today. A rose without thorns was considered an unnatural creation, and a rose with thorns reminded you that sweetness often comes with a risk, and that just because it's pretty doesn't mean it couldn't hurt you. Roses also carried a third meaning, and we often forget this one entirely today, but roses also carried with it the idea of secrecy. There was a Latin phrase called sub rosa, which meant under the rose. It signaled that what was said was meant to remain confidential. Roses could mark private speech, hidden knowledge, and things that could not safely be spoken aloud. Take that meaning and go look at the Tudor roses again and see if that doesn't change your perspective on those symbols. But in England, roses also carried political weight. The memory of the War of the Roses still lingered, and the rose symbolized that lineage, legitimacy, and inherited identity. A rose could quietly invoke family allegiance and even your social position. So when roses appeared, either as symbols or poetry or small gifts, they were never this neutral thing that was being thrown out there. It was always thrown out with something that was layered with meaning. When you take that understanding about roses from the 16th and 17th century and you apply it to the lines Shakespeare gives to Juliet in his play Romeo and Juliet, it casts a different light on what you're understanding. She has the famous line that says, "That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." Now, that sounds very sweet and precious and sentimental, but it's actually not a sentimental line about flowers. To Shakespeare's audience, Juliet is making this radical argument. She's saying that the names, lineage, and inherited identity doesn't determine your worth. And in an era where the rose represented literally the Tudor dynasty, that's a pretty powerful thing to put down to print or to have someone stand on the stage and say. The rose in this instance stands for far more than romance. It stands for social labeling, family allegiance, and political realities. Juliet isn't just praising the rose, she's questioning the power we give to the name. And that idea would have felt dangerous for Tudor England and not quite so sweet. So, when it comes to roses, yes, they were given in Shakespeare's England as gifts, but they weren't these romantic bouquets that you would give in celebration of Valentine's Day for any means. And they weren't uncomplicated at all. Roses were useful. They were used in a lot of medicines and perfumes, and they were symbolic politically and morally, which is exactly why Shakespeare uses them in his plays. If you'd like to go deeper into the history of roses and understand the kinds of roses that were grown for Shakespeare's England, as well as their uses and more about their symbolism, we have an episode with Isu Denser. It's episode 391 of That Shakespeare Life, and you can listen to our entire conversation with Isu at CassidyCash.com/episode 391. Isu was instrumental in putting together a historical rose garden all about Shakespeare's roses and the roses from this time period. So it's a really exciting episode if you want to go deeper into this particular history. And if you'd like to see some of the history, like woodcuts, illustrations, museum artifacts, and the visual context behind roses from Shakespeare's world, be sure to join us inside That Shakespeare Society on Patreon, where we explore the material culture behind these stories about roses from Shakespeare's lifetime. That's it for this week. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.